Hello, everyone. I have a special report. It's pretty much an insight that I got while I was working with some friends and trying to identify different things. And I heard the name Lafayette. And when I heard the name Lafayette, I started looking because I knew that they were trying to communicate to me some information about what was going on at our present time. And of course, things have been very heated, and of course, people are wanting to take names if certain parties get into office. But this is what is going to lead into our situation. What's actually happening has already sort of had an impact from what happened before in an earlier time. Let me explain. I'm going to share screen here, and then we can take a look at. So when I heard Gilbert du Motier, Marquis de Lafayette, sorry if I butcher the language here, but didn't mean to. I think only a few years of high school is not going to cut it to be able to speak proper French. But anyhow, this individual right here, I knew immediately when I started looking at him was Biden. So you're going to say, oh my God, so he was like a hero, he was this, he was that. It's interesting how they use people and then use them again, and this was one of his incarnations. In this case, he really came out looking like very much of a hero and actually had a significant role in the foundation of our nation in the United States, as well as what happened in France. Let me explain. Known in the United States as Lafayette, was a French aristocrat, which kind of fits the profile, doesn't it? And military officer who fought in the American Revolutionary War, commanding American troops in several battles, including the Siege of Yorktown. After returning to France, he was a key figure in the French Revolution. It's interesting that two revolutions were going on. He was involved in both of them. In the year of 1789 and July Revolution of 1830. He had been considered a national hero in both countries. That's interesting. Having a strong impact and a role as one of an aristocrat would probably fall under the category of elite. And you look down here and you look at the names that were involved, and the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen with Thomas Jefferson. Let's see. Lafayette returned to France and was appointed to the Assembly of Notables. These were a group of high-ranking nobles, ecclesiastics, which would probably be priests, or ministerial roles, and state functionaries. So keep in mind, those that were over the church have always had a prominent role, and they were not separated as we see it today. They were more of a equal on the level of political decision making. So, and here again, our aristocracy. So anyhow, I started looking at this. Lafayette returned to France after Napoleon Bonaparte secured his release in 1797, actually. Let's step back here. After forming the National Constituent Assembly, he helped write the Declaration. He helped write it, the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen with Thomas Jefferson. The document was inspired by the United States Declaration of Rights of Independence and invoked natural law to establish basic principles of democratic nation state. He also advocated the end of slavery and the keeping with a philosophy of natural rights. And on the storming of the Bastille, he was appointed the commander-in-chief of the French National Guard and tried to steer a middle course through the years of revolution. And he seemed to have his hands in everything. The radical factions ordered his arrest, and he fled into Austrian Netherlands. And he was captured by Austrian troops and spent more than 5 years in prison. Lafayette returned to France after Napoleon Bonaparte secured the release in 1797. And, you can see that there is interesting, here again, the hero of two worlds, so two nations actually, but it's the larger than life. It seems that they had put him on this pedestal, and we're wondering how this man who seems, quite elderly, has such a persuasion, and when he was younger, you would think that he would have stepped into a more prominent role had his connection been accurate here, but obviously there were the powers that be, the elite, make the decision on who comes in when. But, and this is, sometimes you have to, in order to understand what's going on, you have to look at the fact of who was there and some of their historical accomplishments, or that their past life connections, and the integration into two major societies. Now keep in mind, before the United States started going through major riots, France and the Yellow Vest has been in complete turmoil, and the nation has gone upside down and backwards regarding the rights of the people, or the having the essential needs. And so revolution, it looks like the impact of revolution, or an effort to bring in a revolution in both nations, not to mention other nations around the world. So whatever this energy was, is bringing in some kind of upheaval. And, we perceive the earlier, birthing of a nation, of the U.S., according to the European perspective, that this was, a positive thing, but at the time, I'm sure it was a literal nightmare. And what they're trying to bring in, I'm not really sure if it's the same thing, but the energy of wanting to stir up and create a revolution is definitely prevalent. So they have information here about the early life, and who his wife was, and he had a companion at arms, Joan of Arc's army during the siege of Orleans. I mean, there's so many different names in here. And yeah, that was interesting. This is his connection to the Freemasons. So you start, kind of scrolling down. And I started looking at this saying, wow, this is really, really interesting. There's so much happening here. There's so many, like I said, prevalent people. And you're seeing that he was pretty much in the middle of all of it, and put in, very high regard because of his connection to that. So he returns to France, he goes to the United States, he goes back to France, he keeps on going back and forth and having this impact. We don't necessarily see his involvement in France, but it's possibly there in the background. I don't know what his relationship is with Macron, but who really knows? It seems like he's involved with a lot of different things, or has been over the years, particularly under the Obama administration. And, here's more information. There's the Treaty of Paris that was signed, the Order of St. Louis, talking about John Adams in The Hague. Really, really, so many different major events or decisions, articles that were written, the Declaration of Independence. I mean, pretty much being right there. And I'm going to come back up to this because there's something in here, but I want to just show you something really quick, which is, and there's probably a ton of stuff in here that is worth reading. regarding his involvement. But here is something really interesting. So here's the grand tour of the United States, and President James Monroe and Congress invited Lafayette to visit the United States in 1824, in part to celebrate the nation's upcoming 50th anniversary. Monroe intended to have Lafayette travel on an American warship, but Lafayette felt that having such a vessel as a transport was undemocratic and booked passage on a merchantman. Louis XVIII did not approve of the trip and had troops disperse the crowd and gathered at Le Havre to see him off. Lafayette arrived in New York on August the 15th, 1824, accompanied by his son George Washington, which I think is interesting, having a son that name, and his secretary Auguste Lavoisier. And he was greeted by the group of revolutionary veterans who had fought alongside him. New York erupted for 4 continuous days and nights of celebration. It's interesting. New York just had a big celebration when they thought this thing was a done deal. And then he departed and to a restful trip in Boston instead, which also is a Democratic area. And, it goes on and talks about, how his experience was. So here, the towns of the cities have visited and gave him enthusiastic welcomes, including Lafayetteville, North Carolina, the first city that was named in his honor. He's visited so that they named that city there in North Carolina, and Washington City, and was surprised by simple clothing worn by President Monroe and the lack of any guards around the White House. He went to Mount Vernon in Virginia as he had 40 years before, and this time viewing Washington's grave. He was at Yorktown on October 19th for the anniversary of Cornwallis' surrender, and then journeyed to Monticello to meet with his old friend Jefferson, and Jefferson's successor, James Madison, who arrived unexpectedly. He also dined with 89-year-old John Adams and the other living former president at Peacefield, his home near Boston. With the roads becoming impassable, Lafayette stayed in Washington City for the winter of 1824-25, and thus was there for the climax of the hotly contested here's the clincher right here. He was there for the climax of the hotly contested 1824 election, in which no presidential candidate was able to secure a majority of the Electoral College. Does that sound familiar? It's amazing how history can repeat itself through a soul and bring about the same circumstances, similar circumstances, only in this case it was not him, but I'm wondering if this is karmic because it is now happening to him. And so I will read this again. And thus there was a climax of a hotly contested 1824 election in which no presidential candidate was able to secure a majority of the Electoral College, throwing the decision to the House of Representatives. And I mean, it's not the same issue of the voter fraud or voter question. It's neither one were able to get the Electoral College, and or at least to get the secure the majority of the Electoral College. That's the right way to say it. On the 9th of February 1825, the House selected Secretary of State John Quincy Adams as president that evening, and runner-up General Andrew Jackson shook hands with Adams at the White House as Lafayette looked on. So the question is, what was his role there, and why is he there at all of these significant historical points in time, just about every momentous, powerful event that happened in the U.S. early on, he's there. And then he shows up during an election, and strange enough, they can't come to a majority of the Electoral College. And I was thinking, well, the only other incident that this happened was, the incident with Al Gore, and particularly the state of Florida, and how, that was somewhat controversial. And I didn't recall this part of history. The only reason I even looked here is because they mentioned his name. And when they mentioned his name, and they revealed to me who he was, that this was Joe Biden. And so then I started looking and seeing that he happened to be there when this happened between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. For me, that was pretty powerful. In March of 1825, Lafayette began to tour the southern and western states, and general pattern of the trip was that he would be escorted between cities by the state militia. There's like the police, the militia, the National Guard. He would enter each town through specially constructed arches to be welcomed by local politicians and dignitaries, all eager to be seen with him. I know that this is all familiar to him. He's accustomed to being escorted and brought in as a dignitary. He's accustomed to, his soul memory has to recall all of this in a subconscious way. There would be special events, visits to battlefields, historic sites, celebratory dinners, and a time aside for the public to meet the legendary hero of the revolution. So keep in mind, he was also thrown in prison for his involvement early on in some of these revolutions, and yet, holding a high rank later on. And talk about dropping names, all the significant people during that time period that really changed our world. Here's something about Marxist historians in here too. They deemed Lafayette as an empty-headed political dwarf. Who is this? Let's see. Lafayette's reputation in France is more problematic. Thomas Gaines notes that the response to Lafayette's death was far more muted in France than in America, and suggests that this may have been because Lafayette was the last surviving hero of America's only revolution, whereas the changes in the French government had been far more chaotic. Lafayette's roles created a more nuanced picture of him in France history, especially in the French Revolution. 19th century historian Jules Michelet described him as a mediocre idol, lifted by the mob, far beyond what his talents deserved. Jean Toulard, Jean-Francois Fayard, and Alfred Fierro note Napoleon's deathbed comment about Lafayette in this Histoire et Dictionnaire de la Révolution Française. He stated that the king would still be sitting on the throne if Napoleon had Lafayette's place during the French Revolution. They deemed Lafayette an empty-headed political dwarf and one of the people most responsible for the destruction of the French monarchy. Gaines disagreed and noted that the liberal and Marxist historians have also dissented from that view. Lloyd Kramer related 57% of the French deemed Lafayette the figure from the Revolution whom they most admired in the survey taken just before the revolution's bicentennial in 1989. Lafayette clearly had more French supporters in the early 1990s than he could have mustered in the early 1790s. The Marquis de Lafayette was far from perfect. He was sometimes vain, naive, immature, and egocentric, but he consistently stuck to his ideals even when doing so endangers his life and fortune. These ideals proved to be the founding principles of two of the world's most enduring nations, the United States and France. That is a legacy that the few military leaders, politicians, and statesmen can match. There's a lot said here, and you can see the controversy in people that, try to draw into and persuade. Of course, coming from an elite family, he wanted to make his mark here and wanted to have his name written down in history. Or it was working with someone else who was guiding him to make these decisions, or working with elite families. It doesn't really display here, but it hints that it is very too coincidental, or that he has this astral self that kind of was rewriting the timeline of how things should be, and kind of incorporating them into all of these different things, because it's kind of strange, his heavy involvement in everything. Here's something else that I was drawn to my attention, and I decided to look into it. And I'm looking for the name here. Oh, this is the Habsburgs. They're also involved. And it's coming up to Robespierre is also mentioned. These are some key people. This person right here. Immediately I saw her and I said, that's Kamala Harris. So now I'm looking at someone else by the name of Germain, not Saint Germain, but another Germain, Anne Louise Germain de Stael-Holstein. Would they know each other? Yeah, it looks like it. Commonly known as Madame de Stael, was a woman of letters and political theorist of Genevan origin, so from Switzerland, who in her lifetime witnessed in 1789 to 1815 at first hand the French Revolution in the Napoleonic era up to the French Restoration, and she was present at the Estates General of 1789 and at the 1789 Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen. Her intellectual collaboration with Benjamin Constant between 1794 and 1810 made the one of the most celebrated intellectual couples of the time. She discovered sooner than others the tyrannical character and design of Napoleon, and for many years she lived as an exile, first during the Reign of Terror and later due to personal persecution of Napoleon. The exile, probably because it looks like she was critiquing him. The exile, she became the fulcrum of the Coppet group, also known as the Coppet Circle, was an informational, intellectual, and literary gathering centered on Germain de Stael during the time period between the establishment of the Napoleonic First Empire and the Bourbon Restoration. So, in her unrivaled network of contacts across Europe. Does it sound familiar too? Yeah. Looks like she's very good at networking. 1814, and this is how the personality doesn't change. The modus operandi is usually there, unless there is this big karmic issue where it's accountability. and something changes. But if there's no sense of accountability, then personality continues doing the same things. And so thus we'll, have to deal with whatever this is. I mean, this is greater than, hey, I'm in power, I'm the political, this and that. This is the universe. So people can say whatever they want, but there are unseen forces and there are accountabilities for different things that happen, for everything that happens on the planet. And even though people look like they're getting away with things, they're not really getting away with anything. So in 1814, one of her contemporaries observed that there are three great powers struggling against Napoleon for the soul of Europe: England, Russia, and Madame de Stael. Known as witty and brilliant conversationalists, often dressed in daring outfits, she stimulated the political and intellectual life of her time. Her works, whether novel, travel literature, polemics, were emphasized individually. Passion made a lasting mark on European thought. Yep. Yeah, you can see that. And there's information, her involvement with the revolution. Another one that is supporting revolution. That's pretty much what would be the dominant force. They would be repeating what they've already done. And these were definitely, revolution essentially is a civil war. It was the British against the British. So the Civil War before the Civil War. And I guess that's it. I hope this was helpful and shed some light. Still continuing to hold the highest intention for humanity. We want the highest truth. We want the humanity to thrive. We don't want any unnecessary wars. And, as a collective, we can proclaim the highest intention for humanity. So ask the universe to step in and assist. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and have a good day.